let's regroup here. Let's summarize what you've told us so far. We've got controlling for birth weight, prematurity. Is that the only two we've talked about so far?
Yeah, so adjusting for reporting differences and kind of adjusting for prematurity, you find, the U.S. is still substantially worse off than elsewhere. So even if we had the same levels of birth weight as these other places, things would still be much worse in the U.S.
But not relative to Finland.
But much less so relative to Finland. That's true.
Yes. But relative to Austria.
Slightly worse.
Okay.
But relative to Austria, much worse, slightly worse relative to Finland.
So let's turn to the surprising finding, which is fascinating, which is that neonatal, which I guess means close to birth, as you said, first week or so, maybe first month, U.S. Infant mortality neonatal mortality is very, very good relative to these two countries at least, whereas the, say, month 2 through 12, it's where the U.S. is doing much worse. And this, of course, is not visible in the standard national data because that just looks at any time within the first year. Is that correct?
Yeah, and it's actually, it's sort of even in some sense harder than that because sometimes in these national data sets, they do separate like the first month and the later period. But what they are not able to do is do that controlling for birth weight. So like from a policy, so as economists, like I think, we're interested in like what we would do about policy. And so I think then the question you want to ask is conditional on the inputs that you're given, sort of conditional on the weight of the babies that are born in your hospital. How are we doing at the kind of in the neonatal period, and then how are we doing later? Because that's how you sort of think about identifying policies. And just reporting aggregate numbers, certainly overall in the first year, but even if you separated these time periods, but you didn't think about the differences in inputs, you would still be misleading. So what we find is once we are able to adjust for differences in birth weight, which we're able to do because the data is so rich, as you say, the U.S. actually looks quite good in the early period and then really, really not very good later.
So to say that a different way, let me make sure I understand it. You're saying that if you don't control for birth weight, the U.S. might have still a very high neonatal mortality rate, but that doesn't take account of the fact that the U.S. has lots of small babies, right? Which is increase the risk of death. When you hold that constant, we're actually doing very well. But isn't there a question of why we have such low birth weights?
Yes, there is, but I think that is again related to this prematurity question because that's being driven by a lot of high rates of prematurity, and I think this doesn't say we shouldn't worry about that. We should worry about that, but I think from the standpoint of the sort of neonatal period, the question you'd like to ask is like, is the U.S. having a problem because our neonatal care is really terrible? And if you looked at the aggregate statistics and you saw, oh, look, the U.S. has high neonatal mortality, we might be tempted to think, well, let's like invest a lot more money in NICU care and like, making sure that we're, have high quality hospitals and that the hospitals are teched up in various ways. And
but they already are, of course.
But they already are. Actually, They're doing very well. Their inputs are not very good. But once they get the inputs, things are looking very good. And I think that kind of tells you, yes, let's think about prematurity, but, maybe think about that more so than we think about investing in NICU care.
When you say inputs, you mean the quality of the pregnancy,
the birth weight of the baby.
Yeah.